I had a really strange experience last night that has left me very unsettled. I am not sure what happened, but your channel seems like the best place to get some answers. I live in north-central Florida and have always been fascinated by all things paranormal and cryptid related. My mother is from Romania, so growing up, she would tell me stories about werewolves, vampires, and other monsters that lived in her country, things she heard about when she was a young girl. I do a lot of hiking in the Ocala National Forest, which is just 10 minutes from my home. It's an incredibly beautiful area with many springs and clear water lakes filled with fish. The trail system there goes on for hundreds of miles, with numerous campsites available if you want to spend the night deep within the forest where no one will bother you. My mom worries about me going out alone at times, but this is my favorite way to relax after work or on weekends, especially during springtime when everything is blooming. The trails are well marked here, so even though it can be easy to lose track of time since they go on forever, you're never really lost. As far as animals go, we don't really have wolves or bears around these parts, although we did have a bear sighting recently, but plenty of deer, raccoons, and opossums, along with smaller critters such as squirrels. So now let's get into what happened last night. I got off work early. As soon as I saw the rain outside, which I loved being out in, my first thought was I should head over towards Juniper Springs. This spot offers shelter under trees near small creeks running through sandbars, making it the perfect place to set up camp while staying dry from the rain. I had my gear ready, and I knew exactly where I wanted to go. I arrived at Juniper Springs just as the heavy rain started coming down hard, which actually made it difficult for me to find a spot with enough cover so that I could set up camp. I finally found an area under some trees next to one of the creeks running through sandbars, but unfortunately, there was no way for me to stay completely dry without getting wet in certain areas. As nightfall approached, everything seemed calm outside except for occasional thunderclaps off in the distance, along with lightning flashes lighting up the sky every now and then. Call me crazy, but I really enjoyed this weather. My plan was to go to bed early because being alone during stormy weather can be tiring if you're not used to it. Plus, there's always the possibility of encountering wildlife, such as snakes or other animals, while walking around after dark here. Once inside my tent, all seemed peaceful until around midnight, when I heard what sounded like someone whispering nearby, followed by soft tapping sounds against the canvas wall directly behind where my head lay. It took a moment to realize this wasn't normal noise. Even though I felt unnerved, I decided to ignore it and try to get back to sleep. Well, things escalated pretty quickly after that, because I soon began hearing low growling noises right outside the tent, along with scratching on the fabric above the foot area. I instantly went into survival mode, grabbing a flashlight, which I always kept close by, unzipping the tent, and turning towards the sound source, pointing the beam at the part where the growls came from. At first, I couldn't see anything, except the shadows of tree branches. Seconds later, I caught a glimpse of a large figure moving between trees about 15 feet away. This thing looked massive, its silhouette revealing an outline of a shaggy body resembling a bear or dog, yet something felt off about the shape itself. It didn't look quite right. Despite the fact that it appeared hunched over, similar to how a bear would stand on all fours, this creature seemed to have long limbs with thick muscles that bulged out from underneath matted fur, making me think more along the lines of a werewolf than anything else. Around this time, I started feeling an overwhelming dread wash over my entire body, like someone had dumped a bucket full of icy water down my back, causing my hair, neck, and arms to stand up on end. It was terrifying, especially considering that I felt completely helpless due to being trapped inside a tent during a stormy night. I tried to stay calm, knowing that if I let fear take control, I wouldn't be able to think clearly enough to come up with a plan to escape the situation should the worst happen. It was at this point that I noticed more of them standing near the first one I had seen. It's difficult to explain exactly what these things look like, but the heads were shaped similar to wolves, yet different. This additional group also seemed much smaller compared to the first one that I had seen earlier, possibly cubs or something. The sounds coming from the group included yelping, barking, and growling noises, along with heavy breathing. Fortunately for me, I remained focused on my task, which was escaping unharmed, regardless of how unlikely the odds appeared to be stacked against me. After a few minutes, I heard a low whining sound followed by a series of loud snaps echoing through the forest, indicating something large was moving towards me. Suddenly, several sets of glowing yellow eyes came into view, which confirmed my suspicions about the presence of additional creatures standing just beyond my view. After that, everything happened so quickly that I barely remember how I got out or where I ran next. All I know is that I was able to get away from that spot as fast as humanly possible, given the conditions. My name is Thomas, and this is the story of the winter I will never forget. It all started when I decided to spend a few months alone in a small cabin deep in the mountains. I thought it would be a peaceful time, just me and the quiet snow, but things didn't go quite as planned. The cabin was old but sturdy, made of thick logs that kept out the cold. It sat in a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees, their branches heavy with snow. When I first arrived, everything seemed perfect. I had enough firewood, food, and supplies to last the winter. I was looking forward to the quiet and the chance to read, write, and think. The first few weeks were calm. I spent my days chopping wood, cooking simple meals, and reading by the fire. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the crackling of the fire. Sometimes I would take long walks through the forest, enjoying the stillness and the beauty of the snow-covered landscape. But as the days grew shorter and the nights longer, I started to feel a little uneasy. It was so quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you think you're the only person left in the world. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the loneliness getting to me. After all, I was miles away from the nearest town, and no one knew exactly where I was. One evening, just as the sun was setting, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I bundled up in my warmest clothes and stepped outside. The air was crisp and cold, and my breath came out in little clouds. The snow crunched under my boots as I made my way through the trees. I didn't go far, just to a small hill a short distance from the cabin. As I stood on the hill, looking out at the vast, snowy wilderness, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. It was a feeling, a sense that I was being watched. I turned around, but there was nothing there, just the trees and the snow. I shook my head, telling myself I was just imagining things, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I decided to head back to the cabin. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone following me. But there was nothing, just the darkening forest and the sound of my own footsteps. That night, as I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. I tried to distract myself by reading, but I couldn't concentrate. Every little noise made me jump, and I found myself glancing at the window more than once. Finally, I decided to go to bed. But even there, under the heavy blankets, I couldn't relax. I kept hearing things, little creaks and groans that I knew were just the sounds of the old cabin settling, but they made me nervous all the same. I barely slept that night, and when I did, my dreams were full of shadows and strange noises. The next day, I woke up tired and jumpy. I told myself that I needed to calm down, that there was nothing out there, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I decided to stay close to the cabin, spending most of the day indoors. That afternoon, as I was chopping wood, I saw something that made my heart stop. In the distance, near the edge of the trees, I saw a shape, a large, dark figure moving through the snow. It was too far away to see clearly, but it was big, much bigger than a person. My first thought was that it was a bear, but it didn't move like a bear. It was upright, walking on two legs. I froze, gripping the axe tightly in my hands, my eyes locked on the figure. It stopped for a moment, as if it sensed that I was watching it. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and disappeared into the trees. For a long time I stood there, staring at the spot where the figure had been. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. Was it a bear? Or was it something else? Something my mind couldn't quite understand. I hurried back to the cabin and locked the door behind me. My heart was pounding and my hands were shaking. I knew I hadn't imagined it. I had seen something out there, something that wasn't supposed to exist. Over the next few days, I barely left the cabin. I was too scared to go outside, too afraid of what I might see. But even inside, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. Sometimes, I thought I heard noises outside, soft thuds in the snow, or the creak of footsteps on the porch. But when I looked out the window, there was nothing there. One night, as I sat by the fire, I heard a noise that made my blood run cold. It was a howl, a low, mournful sound that echoed through the trees. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or any other animal I had ever heard. It was something else, something wild and strange. The dense, misty woods were not my usual summer hangout. I lived with my parents in Seattle, where the smell of coffee shops mingled with the constant hum of traffic. But each year, I would escape the city and visit my grandmother's cabin deep in the Pacific Northwest. It was a world away from the bustling streets, surrounded by ancient trees that towered like skyscrapers, and a silence that was both eerie and comforting. My grandmother hadn't always lived in the woods. She used to run a small bookstore in the heart of the city, but when my grandfather passed away suddenly, she inherited the family cabin, a relic from a bygone era. To cope with her grief, she left the city and moved to the cabin, hoping the solitude and natural beauty would offer some solace. She wasn't a woodswoman by any means, but she was determined to make a life out there. The first few years were tough, as she learned the rhythms of the forest, the unpredictable weather, and the isolation. But over time, she grew accustomed to the quiet life, learning the language of the forest and finding peace in its stillness. By the time I started spending my summers there, the cabin had become a well-maintained haven, albeit a rustic one. Our days followed a simple rhythm. Mornings spent collecting firewood and foraging for berries, afternoons wandering the forest trails, and evenings sitting by the fireplace, listening to my grandmother's stories about the old bookstore and the colorful characters who used to visit. It wasn't the lively city life I was used to, but it was honest and grounding, a chance to reconnect with nature and myself. That summer, however, our tranquil routine was disrupted by something neither of us could have expected. A strange, unsettling presence entered our lives, casting a dark shadow over the rest of my visit. The day it happened, the sky was overcast, the kind of gray that seemed to swallow all the light. We were hiking back from a berry-picking trip when I noticed something strange in the distance, deep in the woods. At first, it was just a dark shape among the trees, barely visible through the mist. But as we got closer, I realized it was something, or someone, standing perfectly still between the pines. "Grandma, do you see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She followed my gaze, squinting through the fog. Her hand tightened on her walking stick. "I see it," she murmured, a note of unease in her voice. The figure was tall, much taller than any human should be, with a slender, almost skeletal frame. Its skin was pale, blending into the fog, and its eyes, Huge black orbs seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. It didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe, just stood there, watching us. "Let's go," my grandmother said, her voice suddenly firm. She turned and began walking back the way we came, her pace quickening. I hurried after her, my heart pounding. As we made our way through the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of branches made me jump. But when I glanced back, there was nothing there, just the thick mist and the shadowy outlines of trees. We reached the cabin just as the first drops of rain began to fall. My grandmother hurriedly bolted the door behind us, her face pale and drawn. She didn't say a word as she lit a fire in the hearth and made us some tea. We sat in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "What was that thing, Grandma?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer right away, just stared into the flames. "I don't know," she said at last, her voice barely audible. "But whatever it was, it doesn't belong here." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old cabin, every howl of the wind outside made my skin crawl. I kept picturing those glowing eyes, that tall, unnaturally thin figure. I wondered if it was still out there, lurking in the woods, waiting. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth. My grandmother and I went about our usual routine, but the mood was different. There was a tension in the air, a feeling of unease that neither of us could shake. We didn't venture far from the cabin that day, staying close to the clearing where the sunlight could reach us. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I caught my grandmother glancing nervously at the tree line more than once, her usually calm demeanor tinged with fear. As the days passed, we settled back into our routine. We never spoke about it again, as if talking about it might somehow make it real, might bring it back. I'm a regular kid living in a small town in Nevada. Life here is pretty quiet, and there's not much to do except hang out with friends, play video games, and sometimes ride our bikes around the neighborhood. But a few weeks ago, something happened that I just can't stop thinking about. It's about my classmate, Timmy, and what he told us about Area 51. Timmy is a bit different from the rest of us. He's quiet, always lost in thought, and doesn't really join in on our games. He lives with his dad, who works at Area 51. That's the secret military base everyone's always talking about, where people say they do all kinds of crazy experiments. Some people even believe they keep aliens there, but I always thought it was just a bunch of made-up stories. One day, after school, a few of us were hanging out in the park when Timmy walked up to us. He looked like he had something important to say, but he wasn't sure if he should. We all noticed, so we asked him what was up. After a bit of convincing, he finally opened up. "You guys ever wonder what's really at Area 51? Timmy asked, his voice low. "Yeah, sure," I said, shrugging. "But it's just a military base, right? Nothing special." Timmy shook his head. "No, it's not just a military base. My dad works there and he's told me things. Things I'm not supposed to tell anyone." We all leaned in closer. Timmy had our full attention now. "Like what?" my friend Kevin asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Timmy looked around to make sure no one else was listening. Then he whispered, "Aliens. There are aliens at Area 51. Real ones." We all laughed at first. It sounded like one of those crazy stories you hear on the internet. But Timmy didn't laugh. He looked serious, and that made us stop. "I'm not joking," he insisted. "My dad showed me pictures once. He said I wasn't supposed to see them, but I did. They're not like us at all." Timmy wasn't the kind of kid who made up stories. If he was saying this, then maybe there was some truth to it. "What do they look like?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Timmy hesitated for a moment before answering. They're tall, really tall, like over 7 feet. Their skin is gray, almost silver, and it's kind of shiny. They don't have hair, and their heads are big, way bigger than ours. Their eyes are huge, black, and they don't have pupils like we do, just solid black. And their fingers, they're long, with only 3 on each hand. We were all silent, trying to picture what Timmy was describing. It sounded like something out of a movie, but Timmy was so serious about it that it was hard not to believe him. Have you ever seen one?" Kevin asked, his voice trembling a little. Timmy shook his head. "No, but my dad has. He said they don't talk like we do. They communicate with their minds, like telepathy or something. He said they're smart, way smarter than us. But they're not here to hurt us. They're just watching, studying us." "Why would they do that?" I asked, feeling a little scared now. Timmy shrugged. "I don't know. My dad doesn't tell me everything. He just said that they've been here for a long time, way before we ever found out about them. And the government's been keeping it a secret so people don't freak out. We talked about it for a while longer, but none of us could come up with any answers. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what Timmy had said. I started noticing things I hadn't before, like how there were always strange lights in the sky at night, or how sometimes we'd hear weird noises coming from the direction of Area 51. It was like everything was connected, and I was just starting to see it. I didn't sleep much that night. All I could think about were those aliens Timmy had described and whether they were out there, watching us. The next day at school, I tried to talk to Timmy about it again, but he wouldn't say much. He seemed nervous, like he regretted telling us anything in the first place. "Forget I said anything," he told me. "It's better if you don't think about it." Weeks passed, and things went back to normal, sort of. Then one day, Timmy stopped coming to school. At first, we thought he was just sick, but days turned into weeks, and he didn't come back. No one seemed to know where he was, and whenever I asked the teachers, they just said he'd moved away. But I knew that wasn't true. I tried to talk to Timmy's dad, but he wasn't around either. Their house was empty, like they'd just disappeared overnight. It was like they'd never been there at all. I never believed in the supernatural. Ghost stories were just that, stories. But that changed after I visited a peculiar exhibit at a small museum in town. The centerpiece was a dusty wooden box encased in glass with a label that read, "Diic box." I remember standing there staring at it, feeling an odd sense of unease. The museum curator explained that it was a relic from Eastern Europe, said to contain a restless spirit, a diic. I should have taken the feeling seriously, but curiosity got the better of me. Without thinking, I leaned in close, pressing my hand against the glass. And I swear I heard a faint whisper, almost like a sigh. I pulled back quickly, embarrassed by my reaction. But it was already too late. That night, I dreamt of the box. It was in my room, resting on my dresser, the wood creaking as if something inside was trying to get out. I woke up in a sweat. The image of the box seared into my mind. The dream was so vivid that it took me a few minutes to realize it wasn't real. At least, that's what I told myself. But then the whispers started. At first, they were soft, barely audible, like the rustle of leaves. But as the days passed, they grew louder, more insistent. They followed me everywhere, at work, in my car, even when I was with friends. The whispers were in a language I couldn't understand, but the tone was clear, angry, demanding. I began to see shadows flickering in the corners of my vision, quick and elusive. Every time I turned to look, they would vanish. My cat, usually calm and affectionate, started hissing at empty spaces, her fur standing on end. One night, I awoke to find the box from the museum on my bedside table. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. But when I blinked, it was gone. Just another trick of my mind, I tried to convince myself. But deep down, I knew something had followed me home. I tried everything to rid myself of the curse. I burned sage, sprinkled salt around my home, even consulted with a medium. But nothing worked. The whispers continued, the shadows persisted, and the box haunted my dreams relentlessly. Finally, I decided to confront it. I returned to the museum, heart pounding in my chest, determined to face whatever was tormenting me. The box was still there, untouched, its glass case fogged slightly, as if something warm had been breathing against it. I pressed my hand to the glass once more, this time bracing myself for the chill. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, but I didn't pull away. I spoke aloud, telling the spirit inside that I meant no harm, that I just wanted peace. For a moment, the whispers stopped. The silence was suffocating, and then I heard a single word: leave. The whispers have quieted since then, fading into a distant murmur, but they haven't disappeared completely.